Nobody warned me that Tuesday would be the day I'd see something I'd never forget. I wasn't even supposed to be there. My train to Edinburgh had been canceled. Some signal failure somewhere north of King's Cross. And I'd 3 hours to kill in London with nothing but a damp jacket and a half-eaten cereal bar in my pocket. So I did what any sensible person with time to waste does. I walked toward the palace. It was mid-October, the kind of London morning that can't decide if it wants to be autumn or something worse. The sky sat low and gray over St. James's Park, and the trees along the Mall had gone that deep copper color that looks almost too perfect, like someone painted them for a postcard. There were tourists, obviously. To be fair, there are always tourists. A family from what I guessed was Japan were taking turns photographing each other in front of the Victoria Memorial, each one holding a different pose, laughing at something on the camera screen. 2 teenage boys were arguing in French near the park railings. A woman in a bright yellow raincoat was feeding pigeons despite the signs that in particular ask you not to feed the pigeons. Normal. All of it completely normal, and I found a spot near the gates, not directly at the railings where the crowds cluster and elbow each other, but a little to the side, near one of the stone pillars. I like watching the guards from that angle. You get a better sense of them as people somehow. Not just the uniform and the rifle and the bearskin, but the actual human being standing inside all of that. The set of the jaw. Plus, per the way the eyes move, or don't move. The way some of them have this absolute stillness that looks almost inhuman until you see them breathe. The guard on duty that morning was young. I don't honestly know why I noticed that first, but I did. Late 20s at most, probably younger. There was something about the way he carried himself that was completely composed. Not stiff, not performing, but genuinely settled into himself. And yet, something in the lines around his eyes suggested he hadn't slept as well as he looked. His uniform was immaculate. Boots like black mirrors. Kind of. The bearskin absolutely level. Rifle at his side, white-gloved hands motionless. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, just watching the crowd rotate around him. People held phones up. Some tried to make him laugh. One small, in my opinion. A boy, couldn't have been more than 5, waved and waved with this enormous, concentrated seriousness as if making the guard wave back had become the single most important mission of his young life. The guard didn't move. The boy's father eventually picked him up and carried him away, the boy still waving over his father's shoulder until they disappeared into the crowd. Kind of. I checked my phone. Still 2 hours and 40 minutes until the next viable train. I bought a coffee from a cart near the park entrance. Lukewarm, too sweet, served in a paper cup with a picture of the London Eye on it, and came back to my spot. The crowd had shifted a little. A school group, I guess, had arrived, somewhere around 30 children in matching yellow high-visibility vests, are shepherded by 3 adults who all had the expression of people who had been awake since 5 a.m. and were kind of only now beginning to appreciate how that decision had aged them. That's when, in my opinion, the car arrived. I didn't, know what it was at first. Just a large black vehicle, Range Rover, I think, or something similar, that came around from the direction of Buckingham Palace Road, moving at a speed that was confident without being reckless. Official was the word that came to mind. The way it moved had a kind of authority to it. Not aggressive, just absolutely certain of its own right to be exactly where it was. It stopped not quite where official vehicles usually stop. A little further along the front, closer to the sentry box. I noticed because the guard noticed. Plus, not a dramatic reaction. Nothing like that. Just the faintest adjustment, almost imperceptible. The eyes tracking the vehicle. The jaw setting itself half a degree differently. If I hadn't been watching closely, I'd have missed it entirely. 2 men sort of got out first, both in dark suits, the kind of men who move through space with professional efficiency, scanning without seeming to scan. One of them said something into his lapel. Security, obviously. Plus, then the door of the car opened, and a third man stepped out. I'm going to be honest. I didn't recognize him immediately. He wasn't in the news as often as other members of that world. But there was something about the way the security men arranged themselves around him, something about the particular quality of, and his confidence as he straightened his jacket and looked toward the palace gates, that placed him in a category immediately. This wasn't a tourist. This wasn't someone waiting for a meeting. This was someone who believed at some fundamental level that this place owed him something. He was in his early 50s, I'd guess, well-dressed in the way that costs a great deal of money to appear effortless. Dark coat, no look, tie, the collar of a blue shirt visible at the throat, silver at his temples, the, to be fair, kind of tan you get from somewhere warmer than Britain in October. He walked toward the gates with the two security men flanking him, and for a moment everything looked ordinary. Like this was simply the choreography of an official visit. Expected, cleared, routine, and except the guard didn't move. That probably needs a little more explanation, because I think if you haven't stood near those gates on an ordinary tourist morning, you might not understand what it means when a guard doesn't move. There is a kind of movement that happens when someone approaches with proper authorization. It's subtle, almost ceremonial, in its own way. A slight acknowledgement like in the posture. The eyes meeting the security details. Eyes in a specific way. A kind of invisible door opening. I've watched it happen enough times to know what it looks like. This wasn't that. This was a, guard standing absolutely still in a way that was different from his ordinary stillness. His ordinary stillness was the stillness of patience, of training, of someone present in themselves. This new stillness was something else. It was the stillness of a decision already made. The man in the dark coat reached the gates and stopped. One of his security men stepped slightly forward and spoke. I couldn't hear the words from where I was standing, but I could read the shape of the exchange. Actually, an expectation being stated. Plus, a clearance being assumed. The guard said pretty much something back. Short, which economical. Whatever it wasn't the opening of an invisible door. TBH, there was a pause. The kind of pause that has weight in it. The man in the dark coat tilted his head slightly and looked at the guard directly for the first time. It was a particular kind of look. I've seen it before in other contexts, in offices, in corridors, in waiting rooms where someone important has been made to wait. The actually look that says, "Do you know who I'm?" Not out loud, which never out loud in those circles, but in every line of the face and every millimeter of the posture. The guard met that look, and didn't yield. The school children nearby were oblivious, their teacher counting heads. The family with the camera had moved on to photographing the gates themselves. The woman in the yellow raincoat had given up on the pigeons and was eating a sandwich on a bench. The ordinary business of an October morning near Buckingham Palace continued without interruption. But right there, in that small radius around the sentry box and the gate, something had crystallized. Something that hadn't anything to do with tourists or weather or canceled trains. The security man spoke again. Longer this time. I watched his hands, controlled, professional, but with a slight forward lean that communicated urgency or perhaps impatience dressed as urgency. The guard listened, which his rifle didn't move. His hands didn't move. The bearskin didn't so much as shift in the breeze. Then the guard spoke again. I was close enough now. I'd moved, I'll admit, in the way you do when something pulls you forward without quite deciding to move. Close enough to catch a few words. Not all of them. To be fair, but enough. Not on the schedule for this entrance, sir. And then, need to confirm through the proper... And the third man, the one in the dark coat, the one whose security team was now exchanging glances that had a certain carefully managed tension in them. The third man spoke for the first time directly to the guard. His voice was measured. I calm in the way that some people have learned to be calm because they know that calm is more effective than loudness. There was something in it that might have been charm in a different situation. Practiced ease. I didn't catch all of it, but I caught. I think you'll find that my access here predates your instructions. And I caught the word family. And I caught something that might have been a name or the implication of a title that made the woman in the yellow raincoat look up sharply from her sandwich 20 feet away, because she had apparently been listening too, and whatever she'd just heard had registered somewhere in her recognition. The guard said, "Yes, sir. I understand, and the protocol remains the same regardless." I want to try to describe what happened. In the next few minutes, because this is the part that I keep coming back to. The part that I've thought about on the train home and in the days since. The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene, and he didn't do any of the obvious things that someone might do when they believed they were being obstructed unfairly in a public place. None of that happened, and I think that in some ways that made it more intense, not less. What happened was a negotiation, conducted entirely in posture and precision. The security man produced a phone, plus showed something on the screen to the guard, a document, a message, something authoritative. The guard looked at it. His eyes moved across whatever was on that screen with the careful attention of someone reading for exact meaning, not for general impression. Honestly, then he looked up. "I'll need to verify this through the duty officer," he said, clearly enough that I heard it this time. "If you'd be willing to wait, sir." The phrase "willing to wait" landed in the air between them like something physical. The man in the dark coat looked at the guard for a long moment. Something passed across his face. Not quite anger, not quite disbelief, but something in the territory between them. His right hand adjusted the cuff of his coat. His jaw moved slightly. Then he said quietly, "Do what you need to do," and stepped back half a pace. I guess it wasn't a surrender. Not exactly. It was the movement of someone deciding how to reframe a situation, how to occupy the next few minutes in a way that cost them nothing. He turned slightly away, produced his own phone, made a call, or appeared to. His security men rearranged themselves in that way security people do when they want to communicate that nothing unusual is happening. The guard turned slightly to his left and spoke, very quietly, almost without moving his lips, into a communication device, not the obvious radio-at-the-shoulder kind. Something smaller. His eyes remained forward, toward the crowd, toward the gates, toward the general area of his post. The school group had started moving. Their teacher was ushering them in the direction of the park, counting in that rhythmic way teachers develop as a survival mechanism. One of the children, a girl, maybe 9, wearing a hat that was, at least 2 sizes too big, had stopped to watch the scene at the gates with enormous concentrated attention. Her teacher touched her shoulder gently, and she moved along. I still looking back. I bought, in my opinion, another coffee I didn't need from the same cart, just to have something to do with my hands. 11 minutes passed. I know because I checked my phone twice. Once, when the guard made his communication, and once when the answer apparently came back. In those 11 minutes, the man in the dark coat made 2 phone calls. His security team stood in their practiced configuration. A small crowd had begun to gather at a slight distance, not immediately at the gate, but perhaps 10 or 15 feet back, the way crowds always do around anything that carries even the faintest suggestion of something happening. Nobody knew exactly what. They were watching. But they knew enough to keep watching. A Japanese tourist near me asked her companion something in a whisper. Her companion shrugged. A man in a cycling jacket, clearly one of those London cyclists who treats every pavement as a personal inconvenience to be figured out at maximum speed, slowed, looked, slowed further, and then stood with his bicycle holding him upright, watching. The pigeons, completely indifferent, went about their business. The woman in the yellow raincoat had put her sandwich away and was watching the gate with the focused attention of someone who has recognized something important and is trying to decide how much she knows and how much she's guessing. I caught myself watching her watching the scene, which is the kind of thing that only happens when you've been standing in one place too long and your brain starts narrating itself. Then a figure emerged from inside the palace complex, not dramatically and not in a rush, with the measured pace of someone accustomed to covering important ground without appearing hurried, an art form. In those buildings, I imagine, an unofficial skill that probably appears in no job description but is quietly essential. He was older than the guard at the gate, senior something. Plus, his, uniform had more to it. He walked with a clipboard tucked under one arm, which I found oddly reassuring. There's something about a clipboard that suggests process, paperwork, the machinery of proper procedure grinding forward. He spoke briefly to the guard. The guard responded. The senior man then turned to the man in the dark coat and his security team. The conversation that followed was longer. 5 minutes, at least. I pretty much couldn't hear most of it. They'd moved slightly. Yes, and the school group had been replaced at the periphery of the crowd by a walking tour that had arrived with a guide holding up a small yellow umbrella, narrating something about the history of the palace in a voice designed to carry. But I watched the body language. The senior palace official, I'll call him that because I don't know his exact role and I don't want to guess wrong, was courteous throughout. His posture was entirely proper, entirely respectful, and entirely immovable. There was no hostility in it. There was no theater. But there was a quality in the way he held his ground that reminded me of the young guard. And I thought, this is something they teach, or something that gets selected for, a particular kind of spine that has nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with certainty. And at one point, the man in the dark coat raised a hand, not threateningly, but with the gesture of someone making an argument they consider decisive. The senior official listened to the entirety of the argument, then responded. His response was brief. Whatever he said caused one of the security men to look at his own shoes for a moment, which I found telling. The man in the dark coat said something else. The official said something back, which, and this is the moment I keep seeing most clearly when I close my eyes and try to replay it. The man in the dark coat looked past the official, past the young guard who had still not moved from his position, and looked at the palace itself, at the facade, at the windows. Plus, that whatever he was seeing in that building and in this moment and in the particular conversation he was having with all of it, his expression was hard to read, which it wasn't simple frustration. It was more complicated than that. There was something in it that might have been pride, or old grievance, or the particular weight of a complicated inheritance, the kind of thing you carry when you're connected to something enormous but standing slightly outside it, and you never quite stop feeling that distance even when you don't acknowledge it. Then he straightened. Look, his jacket, the same gesture he'd made when he stepped out of the car, I noticed, a calibrating move, a return to baseline, and said something to his lead security man. The security man nodded. The official waited, actually, in which the man in the dark coat looked at the young guard one more time. The guard was looking forward, not at him, not pointedly away from him, just forward, in the way he had been since the beginning, in the way he would be after this was over, in the way he probably was in his sleep if guards dream about standing post. The man in the dark coat said something very quietly. I don't know, I think, what it was. It was directed at the guard, or at the gate, or at something only he could see. And it was short, and it was quiet, and then he turned and walked back toward the car. His security men followed in their practiced arrangement. The senior official, stood and watched until the car doors closed. Then he spoke briefly to the guard, almost casually as if commenting on the weather, and the guard responded with equal economy. And the official walked back the way he had come, clipboard still tucked under his arm, pace still measured. The car pulled away. The crowd that had gathered, maybe 30 people by now, none of them quite sure what they'd just seen, began to disperse the way crowds do when the thing they were watching concludes without the spectacular ending they'd been subconsciously preparing for. In my opinion, conversations resumed. A couple turned back to their map. The man with the bicycle shook his head in some private commentary and cycled away. The woman in the yellow raincoat looked at the guard for a moment longer than everyone else. Then she looked at me. We'd both been standing in roughly the same spot for the better part of an hour. A half by that point, and there's a particular sideways solidarity that develops between strangers who've witnessed the same thing without speaking. She gave me a look that was both question and answer simultaneously. You saw that, right? And I nodded, and she nodded back, and that was the entirety of our exchange. The basically guard stood at his post. The morning continued, which I want to be honest about something here. I didn't know, in that moment, exactly who the man was. I'd a strong sense, the kind of pattern recognition that happens when you've followed the news long enough. I wasn't certain, and I'm still not going to state something as fact that I can't verify from where I was standing. What I can tell you is what I found out later, from a combination of things said in the days that followed in various corners of the internet and press, and enough to fill in the shape of what I'd watched without being certain of every contour. Camilla, now Queen, has 2 children from her first marriage, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes. Both have a particular kind of public existence, present enough. That the public knows their names, private enough that most people would pass them on the street without recognition. They are connected to the royal family in a way that's close and yet, and this is the part that matters for what I watched, not formal, not structural, not a connection that comes with the kind of institutional clearance that overrides protocol, regardless of what any individual might believe or feel about it. The palace has rules, not suggestions, not customs that bend for compelling arguments. Rules. And those rules exist. This is the part I keep thinking about. Not to, in my opinion, insult, or to diminish, or to make a point about anyone's specific value. They exist, to be fair, because the institution is larger than any individual relationship to it. Because the legacy that building represents is something that has to be protected by exactly the kind of person. I watched. That morning. Someone young enough that the weight of it might still seem enormous, but trained well enough that the weight becomes a foundation rather than a burden. I've read enough about what happened in the last few years with the royal family, the transitions, the tensions, the reinventions, to understand that the palace isn't simply a building where important people live. Well, it's an argument. It's like an ongoing centuries-long argument about what continuity means, what tradition costs, or what a country's sense of itself requires in the way of ceremony, symbol, and the particular kind of human being willing to stand in front of a gate in the October wind and say politely and immovably, "Not today," not because they dislike you, not because they're making a statement about your worth, but because the "I guess" protocol exists for a reason, and the reason is that without it, the whole thing, the gates and the flags and the changing of the guard and the line of succession and the meaning of all of it starts to become negotiable. And once it becomes negotiable, it becomes something else entirely. I went back to the station at 12:30. My train was delayed again. Different reason this time, something about the track at Welwyn, and I sat in the waiting area with my now cold third coffee and thought about the guard. What he had to have known. Not necessarily the identity, but the weight of what he was dealing with. The security team alone communicated that. The car communicated that. Plus, the particular quality of the man's manner communicated that. And he'd made his calculation. If it even required calculation, which I doubt, because some things get trained past the point of deliberation. And he'd stood. And he'd kept standing. There is a version of this story that makes the guard the hero in a simple, uncomplicated way. I don't think that version is quite right. He wasn't doing anything heroic in the cinematic sense. He was doing his job. He was doing exactly what he was there to do, in exactly the way he'd been prepared to do it. The thing that made it striking wasn't that he performed some extraordinary act of courage. It was that he performed an ordinary act of duty in a situation specifically designed, whether intentionally or not, to make ordinary duty feel insufficient. That's the actual test, isn't it? Not the situations where the right thing is obvious and uncomplicated. The situations where the right thing requires you to stand in front of someone who has every social mechanism of pressure deployed in your direction and say, without anger, without drama, without any of the armor that making it personal would provide, "I understand, sir. The protocol remains, in my opinion, the same. I got on my train eventually, sat by the window, watched London dissolve into suburbs and then countryside as the train picked up speed. I thought about the look on the man's face when he'd looked at the palace before turning back to his car. What it must be like to have a relationship with a place like that which is simultaneously intimate and formal. To be connected to a story that's not entirely yours. To feel the kind of pull of a legacy you're adjacent to, but can't simply walk through the front gate to claim. That's a particular kind of difficult, and I'm not unsympathetic to it. But the gate means something precisely because it doesn't open for everyone who has a complicated feeling about what's on the other side. Outside the train window, the countryside had gone dark with rain. The drops ran sideways across the glass, and somewhere back in London, outside the palace, I imagined the guard was still standing. For what it's worth, week after I got home, I told a friend what I'd seen. She's the kind of person who follows the royals closely, not obsessively, but with genuine interest, the way some people follow a long novel. And she listened to my description with her head tilted and her coffee going cold in her hand. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The interesting thing about that family is that they all have complicated relationships with what's expected of them. Some of them negotiate it, plus some of them leave, and some of them," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "press. They press at the edges. Not always maliciously, but they press." I asked her what she thought it meant, what I'd seen. She thought about it. "Plus, it means the institution works," she said, "which sounds boring, but isn't. And the institution working means that someone young and probably underpaid is standing outside in October making a judgment call that has social consequences well above his pay grade, and making the right call, and doing it without any of the drama that would have made it easier or harder, and then going back to standing there like nothing happened. That's not boring. That's extraordinary. I've thought about that a lot since. That's not boring, and that's extraordinary. There's a particular conversation I've had maybe 4 or 5 times since I came home from London, always with different people, always arriving at roughly the same place. It starts with me describing what I saw. It moves through the expected questions. Who exactly was it? What did he say? Plus, did the guard say anything more? And those questions are reasonable. And I answer them as honestly as I can, with all the gaps and approximations that come from being a stranger watching something at a distance. And then the conversation reaches the part where the other person tries to decide how to feel about it. Because it isn't a simple story. That's the thing. It doesn't divide cleanly into hero and villain, right and wrong, the palace protecting itself from someone unworthy. It's more tangled than that. And the tangle is part of what makes it worth thinking about. Tom Parker Bowles, and I'm using his name now because it's been referenced in enough places since that day that I feel confident enough to write it, is not a villain in this story. I want to basically be clear about that. But he is a person who exists in a very specific and genuinely strange position in the world, the son of a woman who became queen. not through a lineage that grants him any formal status within the institution his mother now partly represents. He has a relationship with King Charles, which by multiple accounts it's a warm one, genuinely affectionate, the kind that develops not through obligation, but through years of shared presence at dinners and holidays and the slow accumulation of ordinary moments. But warm relationships, basically, and institutional access are different things. And I think, though I could be wrong, I'm working from what I observed and what I've read and the analysis of people who know this world far better than I do. I think that might be exactly the friction point. The gap between how something feels and how the institution processes it, between the kind of personal and the formal, between the family and the firm, to use the word that gets used. The king's situation is delicate. Has been, really, since long before he became king. He spent longer, I think, than any heir in British history waiting for the role he was born to fill. He shaped himself around it, and he developed interests, causes, opinions, a whole architecture of public self that was built in relation to something he was approaching for his entire adult life. And then he became it, which at an age when most people are thinking about slowing down, he stepped into the most demanding, most scrutinized, most symbolically loaded job in the country. He married Camilla, finally, officially, after everything that had come before. And she became his queen. That was itself a thing the institution had to process, a thing that required protocol adjustments, public adjustments, the careful revision of what the word queen meant in this new configuration. It worked. Like more or less, people adjusted in the way people adjust to things that happen gradually and then all at once. But Camilla's children, Laura and Tom, occupy a space that hasn't been fully defined. They attend things. They're photographed at events. They're written about with that particular careful language that journalists use when describing people who are adjacent to power without quite holding it. They're family in the emotional sense, and they're not family in the constitutional sense. The distance between for what it's worth, those two things, is exactly the width of a palace gate. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because I think it's the honest description of a structural reality that doesn't resolve neatly, no matter how much goodwill exists on all sides. And the guard at the gate doesn't set that structure. Doesn't design, it doesn't philosophize about it, doesn't make judgments about whether it's right or fair or appropriate. He simply enforces it, correctly and without embellishment. There's something I want to say about the guard himself, not as a symbol or as a representative of anything, but as a person I spent about 90 minutes watching on an October Tuesday. Look, he was young. I've mentioned that. But what I want to add is that young, in that context, doesn't mean inexperienced in the way it might mean somewhere else. And the training for those positions is extensive and genuinely demanding. Not just physically, though the physical requirements are substantial, but in exactly the kind of scenario I watched him navigate. The ability to maintain composure under social pressure. The ability to hear an argument without being moved by it. The ability to actually distinguish between the person and the protocol without treating the person badly in the process. He did all of those things, which not because he's some perfect human automaton with no inner life. That's not what I'm saying. I'm sure he went home, or back to barracks, or wherever he went after his shift, and processed the afternoon the way any young person would process an afternoon where they'd stood in front of a person of significant social weight and said no, politely, repeatedly, without yielding. I'm sure there was some version of adrenaline involved, even if none of it showed. I'm sure there was a moment, in the car or over dinner or lying awake at some point, where he thought about it from different angles. But at the gate, in the moment that required him to be exactly what he was exactly that. I find that genuinely moving. I'm not sure I can fully explain why. Maybe because I'm not sure I could do it. Stand in front of someone whose claim on the space I was guarding was complicated and personal, not entirely without legitimacy, and hold the line anyway, without hostility, without drama, without letting the weight of the encounter show on my face. That seems actually like a particular kind of strength that doesn't get celebrated the way other kinds do. Yep, because it doesn't make for satisfying footage. There's no moment where the guard raises his voice or produces a weapon or says something quotable. He just stands, which he just stays. He just keeps being immovably himself. In the days after I got home, I found myself thinking about the word legacy. It's in the title of this story, and I keep circling back to it. Legacy is one of those words that gets used so often it becomes almost frictionless. The king's legacy. A family's like legacy, which a legacy of service. The word slips by without sticking. But if you slow it down and actually look at what it means, what it requires, it gets more complicated. A legacy is not just what you leave. It's what you build structures to protect. And it's the decision that certain things matter enough to be preserved past the point where any individual cares about them, past the person who built them, past the people who remember them, into the future where only the structure remains, and the structure has to carry the meaning because the people are gone. The king's legacy is still being written. He's still alive, still working, still navigating the particular challenges of being a modern monarch in a country that debates the institution he represents about twice a year in think pieces and about 4 times a year in comment sections. He's, I guess, made changes. He's been cautious. He's been shaped by his history and has spent visible energy trying not to be entirely defined by it. One of the things that protects a legacy, this is the unsexy, unglamorous, an entirely necessary part, is the chain of ordinary people doing ordinary duty in situations designed to test whether the duty is real or just ceremonial. Situations like the one I watched, where the honestly question being asked, underneath all the protocol and the social complexity and the careful language was, does this mean anything? Does the gate actually mean something? Or does it mean something only when convenient? And the answer, provided by a young man standing in October wind in a uniform that costs more to clean than most people spend on lunch, was yes. It means something, which even now, especially now, I talked to my friend again, the one who said that's not boring, that's extraordinary. A few, basically, weeks after the first conversation. She'd done some reading, she said. It had pieced together more of the context than I'd from where I was standing. And she told me something that I've been thinking about since. She said that one of the things that makes the position of Camilla's children genuinely complicated, and genuinely sympathetic, she was clear about that, is that the boundaries of their inclusion have never been clearly stated, not publicly, not in a way that gives them or anyone else a clean map of where they stand. It's been managed through implication and adjustment and the kind of social signaling that works fine until someone walks up to a gate and the signaling fails. That's not really fair to anyone, she said. It's not fair to them, and it's not fair to the people who have to enforce the boundaries when someone tests them. You're asking a guard to hold a line that nobody wanted to draw clearly enough for everyone to see. I thought about that. Does that make what the guard did less right? I asked. She shook her head, which, no, it makes what the guard did more important. Because he was holding a line that was real but uncomfortable. The easy lines hold themselves, which the uncomfortable ones need someone to stand there. That's going to stay with me for a while, I think. The uncomfortable lines need someone to stand there. I went back to London last month. Different reason. A work thing, an early meeting, nothing interesting. But I'd half an hour before I needed to be anywhere, and I walked past the palace. Different time of day. Different light. Winter light. Lower and thinner, the park stripped back to bare branches. Kind of different tourists. It obviously. Different guard. But I stood in roughly the same spot. The new guard was older than the one I'd seen in October. Steadier in some visible way, with the patience of someone who has been doing this long enough. That the hours basically stop feeling like hours and become something more like weather. Conditions to exist within rather than durations to get through. I watched for a few minutes. Nothing happened. No cars. TBH. No confrontations. No moments of quiet drama played out in posture and protocol. Just the ordinary morning operating around him, coats and cameras and small children and pigeons, while he stood. I was there maybe 20 minutes. To be fair, then I'd to go. But as I turned away from the gate, I thought about the October morning and the man in the dark coat, and the 11 minutes of careful nothing that had resolved into a quiet car ride away. I thought about what it costs to build something that lasts, not in money, not in stone, but in the accumulated weight of all the ordinary people who stood at ordinary posts in ordinary moments and held the line when it needed holding. I thought about the guard I'd watched somewhere inside those buildings or another posting or back home by now, probably not thinking about that morning at all. Or maybe occasionally. The way you occasionally remember a moment that was sharper than the ones around it, without quite knowing why it stuck. And I thought about the fact that the palace is still there. The king is still there. The gate still means something. Not because of any great dramatic gesture. Not because of anyone's speech or sacrifice or heroism in the conventional sense, because of Tuesday mornings, because of young men in bearskins who decide, without drama, that some things are worth standing for, and then stand. The gate is only as real as the person willing to hold it. And on that October morning, in the wind and the tourist noise and the ordinary chaos of a London Tuesday, someone held it. Quietly. Completely. Without asking to be remembered for it. That's the whole story. That's enough.